Alright guys, welcome back. We have Chapter 2, the Ezio Trilogy. Assassin's Creed 2. After the success of Assassin's Creed, two important things happened. One was surprising, the other was not. The unsurprising thing was that Ubisoft wanted a sequel. The Montreal team had created a solid foundation for a brand new franchise, and after years of working on the original, they had a lot of ideas that they wanted to implement in a follow-up title. Yet they also knew that there were shortcomings. The surprising thing was how much Ubisoft was prepared to bet on a sequel to Assassin's Creed. In the wake of that first title, Jade Raymond and company went out to Paris to pitch a second game in the franchise to Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot. The presentation was a success, but then came something Raymond was completely unprepared for. We presented the pitch for Assassin's Creed 2 to Yves, and he said it was great, she remembers. But then after the meeting, he told me he wanted to give us an even bigger budget that we had requested. He wanted us to be even more ambitious. That's probably the only time in my career I've been told that. Usually it's okay, that's good, but try and do it with fewer people and do for less money. As well as being allowed to grow the core Montreal team, Raymond was allowed to use 2 extra studios from Ubisoft's growing network of developers around the world. Ubisoft Annecy and Ubisoft Singapore were brought into the mix, and, alongside Montreal, set about creating something even more ambitious than the first Assassin's Creed. While this increased budget could be viewed as a recognition of Assassin's Creed's impact on Ubisoft, it was also an indication of how the games industry changed at that point in time. During the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation, the budgets of blockbuster games soared, creating something akin to an arms race in the industry. I also think Yves felt that we were entering this era of monster games, Raymond explains. AAA was no longer good enough. It had to be quadruple A. If you look at the difference between Grand Theft Auto 3 and Grand Theft Auto 4, or what Activision was doing with Call of Duty, where they were reducing the number of games they made and putting all their studios onto a couple of franchises, I think Yves felt like that was the best strategy. Make fewer games, but go really big on them. Only a big publisher like Ubisoft could do that. And obviously he felt like Assassin's Creed was big enough that we could do that. He wanted to make the bet, and looking at the market, he probably thought this was the right approach. The Brotherhood. With the increased backing of Ubisoft and the larger pool of developers at their disposal, the Ubisoft Montreal team started work on Assassin's Creed 2 in January 2008. Though the task in front of them was hugely ambitious, they had a lot to work from, and they had learned a lot from the franchise's debut. Clearly the narrative was important, Guisden says. The present-day story was hugely important, and, at the time, still very mysterious. The ending of Assassin's Creed is full of suspense with the bleeding effect. All of a sudden, the player is asking themselves what is going on. Why can they see these cryptic visuals in the world? The narrative was obviously one of the key pillars, while the visual quality and animation were definitely factors that put us above and beyond. Also, there were things like inertia. You could feel the weight of Altair when you touched the ground. It was not just a floaty avatar like in many other games. Therefore, the quality of animation, quality of visual, and quality of narrative were all very good. During Assassin's Creed's development, the team had come up with a massive list of potential ideas for gameplay that never made it into that release. We had this huge corkboard covered in post-it notes for all the different features that we wanted to make for Assassin's Creed, Bergeron says. At the end of development, something like a quarter of those post-it notes had been removed. We still had 3/4 of the board filled with features. The studio had less than 2 years to make Assassin's Creed 2. The game was already set to come out in November 2009, meaning that the team had to be careful with what gameplay features they decided to pursue. A lot of this process is knowing what you want to do and then choosing what's going to have the biggest impact for the game, Bergeron explains, and we knew we didn't have the luxury of a lot of time. The aim with Assassin's Creed 2 was to tell a much grander story than the first entry in the series, as well as focus more on narrative. The team also wanted to add in new verbs, things that the player can do, into its game design philosophy. In Assassin's Creed, the only verb we had was kill, Bergeron explains. That was the only objective we had. We had to come up with new verbs for Assassin's Creed 2, and from there design the stories we wanted to tell with those blocks. One of the guiding lights for the group was increasing the amount of content for players to experience, but also making sure that everything about the game was, well, enjoyable. The things that were fun in Assassin's Creed, running on rooftops, parkouring around the cities, fighting, and actually being stealthy, were not what the player was being asked to do about 70% of the time. You had to do all these investigations to unlock your assassination mission, but they were not requiring you to use the fun mechanics. Players enjoyed parkouring around the city. Instead, we were asking them to sit on a bench and eavesdrop. They wanted to be in sword fights with guards, but we asked them to get into fist fights and beat someone up. It wasn't in sync. So we asked ourselves what our core gameplay pillars were. These were social stealth, fighting, and navigation. These three pillars can perhaps best be seen in the redesigned guards of Assassin's Creed 2. Whereas before, these foes were limited to patrolling the streets and only attacking if the player provoked them or broke enough rules. Now your foes were far more versatile. You had the Agiles, who chased you, even on rooftops, Gwazin says. Even there you weren't safe. Then there were the big armored brutes, who were super tough to fight. And finally there's the Seekers, with their long sticks that were able to get you out of bales of hay, for example. This extended into how the team designed other non-playable factions within the world of Assassin's Creed 2. The thieves would run with you, the mercenaries would fight you, and the courtesans could hide you, Gwazin explains. Those three pillars really became the structure of everything. Of course, trying to implement this gameplay required an awful lot of work. In order to introduce these mechanics, the AI systems from Assassin's Creed needed to be entirely rebuilt. Every time you take a game and try to make it better, you realize that a lot of things have to be reworked from the ground up, Puel says. For instance, we needed to take out the AI from Assassin's Creed and rebuild it from scratch. It's always risky and feels like surgery. We had an incredibly talented team that took that risk. But it also meant that for months and months we were not able to truly play the game while the team was building the AI. If there is one word to describe the approach that the group took to improving upon the formula of Assassin's Creed, it would be depth. Every system from the original game was improved upon and vastly expanded. That's not to say there was nothing new in Assassin's Creed 2, far from it. For one thing, the team introduced an in-game economy system inspired by role-playing games, RPGs. One of our mottos was, everybody becomes an opportunity, Gwazin says. It had to give players the chance either to hide or, for example, to pickpocket. A huge addition was the economic system. This meant we could add a lot of content and value to the experience. Players suddenly have their own personal objectives to set. If they want new armor or a particular resource, how do they get the money for that? That was the first step toward really giving players more agency. A new hero. Along with the new setting, players would also be taking on the role of a new main character in Assassin's Creed 2. This likely wasn't surprising when you consider the title takes place several hundred years after the original. Every assassin is inspired by their time period they're in, Puel explains. I think it's fair to say that when we talk about the Third Crusade, it was a difficult period. Those were dark times, and we wanted a hero who reflected that very violent time period where religion was everywhere. In that setting, a warrior monk made sense. But when you move to the Renaissance and want to express what that period was like, we wrote a character who has more panache, who is flamboyant, who reflects this time period. The hero in the Italian Renaissance couldn't be a warrior monk. Enter Ezio, or Ezio Auditore da Firenze, to give him his full title. While Altair was raised from birth to be a stoic killing machine, Ezio came to the assassin life after the death of his family. The first pitch for the narrative was a hero's journey in all its essence, Gwazin remembers. It was about taking a teenager whose life is nice and who lacks for nothing, but then everything crumples. How does he get out of that? He has lost his entire family. So he needs to hide. It's similar to the Count of Monte Cristo. He will come back. Vengeance is already a strong motivator. Much of the same design language was used for Ezio as was used for Altair. Both have white robes with red detailing. Both have bird of prey inspired peaks on their hoods. Ezio's name is even derived from the Greek for eagle. But because of his arrogance and flamboyance, developers came up with a different set of references for Ezio. If you pay attention to the visuals we use for him, Ezio's attitude is similar to that of a bullfighter, explains Aymar Azaria, or Aziza, the director of Transmedia and Business Development for Ubisoft Montreal. The way he poses, the way he strikes, is about having a real kind of bravado. He acts like he is good and he knows it. That bullfighter attitude helps shape the character. That's why he has the cape over one of his shoulders. That's very different from Altair, who is driven and efficient. Ezio has some panache that we didn't see before. The whole point wasn't to make a clone of Altair hundreds of years later. The point was to discover someone new. Not only was he more of a charismatic character than Altair, Ezio was also going to have more development. Assassin's Creed 2 was a huge project with a far bigger scope compared to the original game's 9 missions. This allowed the team to show the character in a greater variety of situations. We had access to what we call walk and talks, Bergeron says. In Assassin's Creed, we couldn't have an NPC walk beside you while things were calm in order to provide narrative exposition. For example, we could not have done that quest where Leonardo da Vinci is walking Ezio through Venice before. The variety of objectives allowed us to tell a richer story that wasn't purely about killing. We were trying to tell the story of a nobleman's son who has been wronged and who is seeking revenge. We wanted to have a deeper background to this character, so we had some quests where you'd be picking flowers or going on a date with a girl, which we wouldn't have been able to do before. Jeffrey Yohalam, who acted as a writer and a lead writer on several Assassin's Creed games, adds, "In Assassin's Creed, missions are obstacle courses. They just test your abilities to collect certain things, and there isn't much framing. In Assassin's Creed 2 and onward, we had a lot more time to properly flesh out those side missions and make them character-driven. We got to revolutionize game narrative, too, and really focus on character. The idea is that every mission and every moment of gameplay connects with an emotion or a side of the person who you're playing. In Assassin's Creed 2, you gather feathers for a mother who went through a terrible trauma that's only hinted at all in the script, and she's not speaking about it. You collect feathers for her that remind her of her dead son. Ultimately, that incredible gesture causes her to break out of that state of grief. Thanks to Ubisoft's increased investment in Assassin's Creed 2, the team could add a lot more depth to the world. This included linear gameplay sequences that were created by the Ubisoft Singapore team, which were hidden areas that players could complete in order to be rewarded with Assassin's Seals. These were experiences that typically lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, Ubisoft producer Carl Luhy says. At the beginning, we thought we would try making 10 and then cut a few of them away, if they didn't meet the quality we wanted or if we weren't quick enough to finish them all. But in the end, all 10 were in the game, and so we were really happy with that. Wiesden adds, the team, they added a real depth to the open world. It was not just at the surface anymore. You could enter the buildings and discover caves, the interiors of the big basilica, churches, and so on. But at some point, Ubisoft HQ said, okay, all this is cool, but we need to go big, and we added more. From Italy with Love. Compared to the Third Crusade, there were a lot more famous historical figures present during the Italian Renaissance, at least ones who are better known to the general public. When you say the Third Crusade to someone, it's hard for them to identify famous historical figures from the period. When you mention the name of someone from that age, people probably won't know who they are. But when you talk about the Italian Renaissance, people have at least heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo, Bergeron laughs. Anybody who's been to school a little bit has an idea of the Italian Renaissance. We are starting from a better position when it comes to pop culture knowledge of that era. Raymond adds, one of the things that were so appealing about the Italian Renaissance was how well known the characters are in that period. Everyone has heard of Leonardo da Vinci. A lot of people have heard of Machiavelli, and Machiavellian is a commonly used term. There's also the Medicis and so on. When we talk about the promise of the Assassin's Creed brand, living pivotal moments in history, meeting some of these key people, and learning some of their stories from a different perspective, we felt that the characters really put the Italian Renaissance over the top. While ultimately a fascinating and colorful period in which to set a game, the Italian Renaissance wasn't a hit with everyone. In fact, when Ubisoft Focus tested the setting in the US, the results didn't inspire a lot of confidence. I remember vividly when we started our first consumer experience, Azaza says. We gathered some players and were testing ideas and concepts with them. The first tests that we conducted in the US were absolutely horrible. We asked players about the Renaissance as a setting, and they were just thinking about Renaissance fairs, dragons, and knights. You see a lot of games with historical settings, like strategy titles, but it's quite unusual to have an action-adventure game with that kind of setting. With Assassin's Creed 2, the team decided to double down on featuring historical characters who were alive during the period. Perhaps the most notable of these is the famed artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci. He serves as Ezio's gadget man, furnishing the assassin with goodies such as a flying machine, as well as upgrading our hero's equipment. On paper, this definitely sounds like it could be cheesy and insensitive. After all, these were real people that the team was portraying. During Assassin's Creed 2, the brand was maturing, Bergeron says. We were becoming better at understanding exactly what it was. It's about putting players in a historical context, and a historical context is not only about the environment, but also the people that inhabit it. Our idea was that it'd be cool to meet the people who inhabited these places in history. That did bring its own challenges. These people had a life. We knew where they were in any given period of time. Some people are less documented than others, but someone like Leonardo da Vinci has been researched quite extensively. There's quite a few books written on him, so we have a general understanding of where he was in his life. The specific time frame of Assassin's Creed 2 also allowed the game to feature a slightly different Leonardo da Vinci to what most people have seen before. Leonardo da Vinci was young at the time, Gleason says. "We're used to the old man with his long beard. We thought this was a really good opportunity to not have Leonardo as the old wise mentor, but as a very vibrant, living, full of energy man that he actually was. He was perfect to play the role of Q, like in the James Bond films, giving the player all the gadgets, all these new systems that we wanted to bring to players. He was perfect because everybody knows him. Portraying Leonardo da Vinci was fairly easy, given that he is an ally to Ezio, but the team had to be slightly more cautious when it came to Assassin's Creed 2's real-life antagonists. Rodrigo Borgia was our main bad guy for Assassin's Creed 2, Bergeron explains. We had to always tell our stories as, here's your target, but you can't reach them. There was a lot of jumping through hoops to make sure that we extended that person's lifespan to the right moment. These are people who died in very specific places because of very specific situations. That was constraining for us, since as quest designers we wanted to introduce these people, but we didn't want the player to be able to kill them until they actually died in history, so as not to create an anachronistic timeline. In a way, not being able to kill some of the characters due to historical reasons results in a more complex tapestry of the era. You aren't just seeing the beliefs of Ezio and his allies, you are also being exposed to conflicting ideologies. Getting to know these people who are a part of a historical period adds another dimension, Bergeron says. We were presenting players with a different perspective on the time period that they wouldn't have seen if they were just killing people. We have the chance to portray the ethics, values, and philosophies of a given time period through the characters' words and actions. In order to balance real-life events with a desire to be able to create fun situations for players to enjoy in Assassin's Creed 2, the team created what it called the 30-second rule. The idea was that if someone Googles an event, a character, a location, a building, or whatever, what they discover by quickly reading for 30 seconds, that's what we know. That's the history, Gleason explains. Now, because we know almost everything about someone like Leonardo da Vinci's life, we know where he was and when, what he did, and so on, we didn't want to respect all of this. You could find that out, but you would need to look much deeper than just typing his name into a search engine. So we respected the big dates and who he was, but that gave us enough room to bend reality and tell our story in the middle. Home Sweet Home. While the main Montreal team was hard at work on the core of Assassin's Creed 2, in December 2008, Ubisoft's Annecy studio was brought in to work on a specific part of the experience, the Villa Auditore, the fictional ancestral home of Ezio. They were also responsible for the very real city of Monteroni, where it was located. It was a super focused project, Ubisoft Annecy art director Mathieu Grandjean says. At first glance, you might think this was just a bit of outsourcing, but it was more of a collaboration, because we pushed a lot of ideas. To be totally transparent, it wouldn't have stayed in the game if it wasn't decent enough. It was a test, but it was really good and very appreciated by all the team. They really wanted to keep it and for us to go to the end. The idea of having an area of the game where the player can just chill out was something entirely new. There are some new features here that had never been in the game before, Grandjean says. I don't know if this idea of a homestead, that the character has a home that the player has to take care of, was new, but it was the first time that it had been done on this scale in a AAA game. When it came to designing the villa, the Annecy studio approached the project with story in mind. Everything had to have some kind of relation to the story. The design for each room in the villa was done with some kind of narrative or gameplay purpose, Grandjean explains. There was a Leonardo da Vinci room, the mini-city room, where you can see the progress you have made at restoring Monteroni. There is the nest on top of the tower, which is quite a secret room. There is the underground. There are a lot of things like that. All those details were done with the narrative in mind. As mentioned earlier, while the city of Monteroni is very real, the Villa Auditore is not. It does have a real-world inspiration in the Villa di Milano, which holds a special place in Grandjean's heart. The Montreal team's art director, Mohamed Gambouz, asked me to find a design for the villa, he explains. I'm French, but my mother comes from an Italian family, so I spent a lot of time in Italy when I was young. I had this image of this villa in my mind, and I spent 3 days searching for a photo of this place on Google. Eventually I found it, and he agreed that this was what we needed to aim for. This villa is part of my childhood. I must have gone there on a school trip when I was young. Assassin's Creed 2 producer Sébastien Puel felt that creating the villa was a hugely important addition to the story. If you look at all the great heroes out there, most of the time you know where they live, he says. You know where they hide out. That created a deeper connection with the character. Creating the city of Monteroni was also a challenge. While it was a real place that the group could visit and take reference photos of, this was the Annecy's team's first attempt at translating reality into a video game. It feels quite authentic if you take a bird's eye view of the city, Grodjon says. The problem is in creating organic cities without a lot of navigational constraints, so that the player doesn't end up stuck in a location with no way out. All those elements had to be very well chosen to create the feeling that it's not just a level designed to look like a city, but that it's an actual historical city. This is the main challenge in each Assassin's Creed, because every time we create a real city, there have to be systems created that feel rich and vibrant, but which are actually inside a quite constrained system. Though it still required a lot of hard work, Assassin's Creed 2 is a far less treacherous development than the original Assassin's Creed. For one thing, the crew didn't have to flesh out an entirely new IP. They also didn't have to build an engine from scratch to power this new creation. What stands out to me is just how smooth development was compared to the original Assassin's Creed, Raymond explains. We had an engine that worked, we had a full team, we knew what the brand was, and we had a list of features. The other thing that stood out to me was that we had a better understanding of the storytelling we wanted to do. In contrast to Assassin's Creed, the team was able to do more conventional storytelling in Assassin's Creed 2. For the first time, Ubisoft's chief creative officer had mandated that the player should never lose control of the character, even during cutscenes. We were able to do more fully realize the story and cinematic moments that we had in mind, Raymond explains. Obviously, for an action-adventure, that element is really important. In my opinion, the biggest difference that players felt, possibly without being able to put their fingers on it, was that it was like a well-realized story with cinematics in it. There was also a desire to shake up the way the plot in Assassin's Creed 2 would be told. It needed to be more unpredictable. To me, Assassin's Creed was incredibly beautiful and photorealistic, but it felt a bit empty, Yoelham admits. After playing it, I bumped into Patrice. He was taking a smoke break one day, and I was outside at the same time. So I started talking to him about what I thought was missing from that game. He ended up interviewing me about what I would add or change in the first game. I don't remember what I said specifically in that meeting at all, but I definitely said that the story had to be less predictable. The first game was designed so that players knew the number of assassinations that they were going to have to do. It was always the same idea. The player went after a target, and then they killed the target. Players already knew in advance what was going to happen. I suggested making things less predictable. It should be a story where you don't know what's going to happen next, because the narrative structure is less visible. Yoelham was hired to help design the game's economic system, but ended up working on its script, having previously graduated from Yale with a degree in English literature. If nothing else, he wanted to drag video games from being narratively clunky to the medium previously lacking the fidelity to portray the subtleties of real human emotions, to being on the same level as theater, TV, and film. There were scenes where a character would do something that was inconsistent with that character's drive or desires, he remembers. Accordingly, I highlighted things like that, as well as moments where subtext could be written into the lines. That was a big deal, because in games before that, a character's visual expressions weren't very clear because they were so pixelated or weren't high fidelity. Characters weren't mocapped, so writers had been putting subtext, the character's actual desire in a scene, into the text. In real life and dramas, characters hide those desires. They could be talking about fixing a car with someone, but really what they're talking about is wanting to hook up with that person. The team knew they were working on something huge. This was going to be the next big thing, a project that realized what the developers had tried to do with the original Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed 2 was shown off for the first time at E3 with a CGI trailer that showed Ezio hunting down his targets at a masked ball. This trailer was created in collaboration with Digic Pictures, a 3D animation studio that specializes in CGI and a company that Ubisoft continues to work with in the present day. Getting the trailer from Budapest, Hungary, where Digic is located, to Ubisoft's Paris headquarters ahead of E3 was a bit of a trial. At the time, the internet was not as fast as it is now, Picard remembers. To be able to transfer a file, especially before E3, when everyone was sending files on the Ubisoft network, was incredibly slow. Getting the trailer from Budapest to Paris would have taken days, literally days. Therefore, we had to put someone on a plane to get a hard drive from Budapest to Paris that same day. Then we gave the hard drive to the Paris headquarters before they left for Los Angeles. Thankfully, they managed to get it in time. Today, it's much simpler. It's just downloading a few gigabytes. This was followed by a gameplay demo with the same setting that had our protagonist using a flying machine developed by Leonardo da Vinci. Demos at the time were not recorded. They were played live, Ubisoft Montreal senior producer Julien Lafayette says. I remember having goosebumps and nerves about whether everything would go according to plan. Would we showcase the good stuff? Would we crash the flying wing? That sort of thing. It ended up being a really, really cool moment. Surreal, to be honest. In the wake of this fancy reveal, hype soared once more. But as opposed to the original Assassin's Creed, where the development team had to cut content in order to meet the release date, the studio found this round of hype much more positive. For us, it was fuel, Bergeron says. It was the exact opposite of what we had been feeling at the end of the original Assassin's Creed. We had put so much effort and so much love into it. We finally had a version that we were all happy with. This is the game we wanted to make when we're making Assassin's Creed. This demo showcased it, and people reacted so positively. We definitely felt we were onto something. Even before showing it, we had a pretty good idea that we were on the right track, and the reaction was all the confirmation we needed. We just had to finish it. The end of Assassin's Creed 2's production was amazing. The entire production was probably one of the best in my career, to be honest. With the first game, it felt like we were almost slapped in the face, and we knew we could have done better. We knew what we needed to do. The reaction to the trailer told us that we had put our eggs in the right basket. We just needed to finish it. As part of the process of promoting Assassin's Creed 2, Ubisoft rented a villa in Florence for a press event. Despite working on the game and recreating the cities of Florence and Venice, some of the staff hadn't yet traveled to Italy. One night we had 2 hours free and we all went on a tour of the city, Peel remembers. I said to my team, "Okay, now take me to the Duomo," and several people who had never been to Italy before were like, "Oh, I think it's left here, then right, and left again." They navigated us to the Duomo because they had learned the city from making this game. That was truly an amazing moment. Assassin's Creed 2 went on to launch in November 2009 to almost universal acclaim. If the original title was only an appetizer of the vision that the team had for this new franchise, its sequel was the full meal. Critically, it was a smash hit, as well as hitting it out of the park commercially. Within its first week, Assassin's Creed 2 had sold 1.6 million copies around the world, with shipments closing in on 9 million units by May of the following year. Not only did it properly establish a franchise that would help define Ubisoft for the coming years, Assassin's Creed 2 helped define the open world game as we know it today. We didn't do open worlds until we worked on Assassin's Creed, Bergeron says. That established what making open world games was at Ubisoft. Assassin's Creed 2 set the benchmark for the modern open world format, both for us and the rest of the industry. When it comes to open world games, the industry emulates parts that we originated. We're definitely proud of that. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, banding together. From the start, the Assassin's Creed core team had envisioned the series being a trilogy. The third and final part of the franchise was to be set in the year 2012. Initially, we looked up the Mayan calendar that predicted the end of the world in 2012, Raymond says. We thought, okay, we'll be able to make 3 games, and the last game will take place in 2012, in the present day. Everything that Desmond had learned through reliving these past lives was going to help with this final episode. That was the original plan. Waysden adds, the idea with this trilogy was to send the message that everything is cyclical. Destruction would occur and humankind would start anew. But in the far future, people would have looked at Desmond's story and would have viewed him as some kind of prophet-type figure. These plans changed with the wild success of Assassin's Creed 2, which was even more of a critical and commercial hit than its predecessor. What was meant to be a series with a finite number of entries and a clear endpoint became a forever franchise. During Assassin's Creed 2's development, it was decided that the team would follow up with an expansion or piece of DLC. This title was called Brotherhood, and it was said to be an expansion of the main game. As history shows, this plan didn't last long. Very quickly, Brotherhood became its own Assassin's Creed title. Brotherhood took place in the same timeline as Assassin's Creed 2. Ezio is the only character who has starred in more than one game, Raymond says. That was really the shift. It was supposed to be Ezio and then a different assassin. It broke that initial plan. And with the second game being even more successful than the first, it was clear that the franchise wasn't going to stop after 3 entries. We were asking ourselves, what is a game called Brotherhood about? Yohalam explains. The game director talked about it being on your phone, but that didn't end up happening. It was a game where the player was going to train assassins. Then the art director had the idea that he wanted the city to start out in rough shape. There would be these 3 to 5 layers where the city would go from seedy to glorious. He had figured out how to create the sense of transformation with these layers and was really invested in that idea. This became a portion of the game similar to the Villa Auditoria from Assassin's Creed 2, where the player could restore and renovate the city of Rome. The actual name of Brotherhood was something of a debate. Yes, this was a sequel to Assassin's Creed 2, but did it do enough to the next numbered entry in the franchise? During development, there was a lot of discussion. Should we call this Assassin's Creed 3? Should it be Assassin's Creed Rome? Guesden says, in the end, Brotherhood just made the most sense. While the team had almost 2 years to create Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood was made in far less time. But by this point, everyone had a lot more familiarity with the tools at their disposal. The game had a solid foundation in Assassin's Creed 2. We were building on the know-how and technology that we had, Bergeron says. We were making the best we could with what we knew how to do, which is fun in and of itself. The great part about working on DLC is that you don't have to create things from scratch. The technology is already stable, your tools are stable, and you know how to use them. Brotherhood was that for us. We knew how this engine worked, we knew how the tools worked, and we knew your character. We wanted to continue the story and make it even better. When in Rome. Like Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood was hugely inspired by ideas the team had wanted to implement in the previous game, but which they weren't able to do due to production constraints, including the setting. Rome was supposed to be part of Assassin's Creed 2, Bergeron says. We had said that the game would have 3 cities, Venice, Florence, and Rome, but quickly into production we realized that it just wasn't going to fit within our scope. It wasn't possible. As part of the process of creating Rome and Brotherhood, the team stumbled across a map from 1461 that helped the developers come up with a layout. It was very interesting because medieval Rome was much smaller than it was during the Roman Empire, Guesden remembers. There was this mix between a newer Renaissance-style building that we could tactically reuse from Assassin's Creed 2, and structures from Roman antiquity, like the Colosseum and the Roman baths. In Brotherhood, we could do a fresh take on these older buildings. Due to Brotherhood's short development timeline, the team could only focus on one setting, whereas Assassin's Creed 2 had featured a few cities with a variety of activities that the player could engage in. Ubisoft had to figure out how to make the most of just one city. We focused entirely on Rome, Guesden says. We wanted to have 3 different types of environments to support our gameplay pillars. Having a dense urban city was essential for social stealth. There were the ruins, which the player could navigate around. Finally, there were open areas, the countryside, where we could use the horse. We basically divided this massive map into 3 big sectors supporting different types of gameplay. Bergeron adds, people wanted to play around in a larger given space. That's where the format for Rome came about. The idea that there was only one world in Brotherhood, which meant people had a bigger, cohesive space. From there, the team came up with ways to fit a narrative within the version of Rome that it was creating. We worked hard to identify landmarks that would be the key visual points, Guesden says. When you first structure the space, you want to have very cool and significant locations to visit during missions or during the story. From Castle St. Angelo, where the Pope was, to Tiber Island, where we put Ezio's hideout. There's also the Pyramid of Cestius, which is actually built into the Aurelian walls around the city. The pyramid is super cool, and it helped us craft all the hidden societies in this game. Ezio's character arc in Brotherhood was also intended to be part of Assassin's Creed 2. We wanted to do a lot more within Assassin's Creed 2, Guesden says. Our initial intent was to bring Ezio from a teenager to the mentor role that he eventually takes on in Brotherhood, but all in the same game. That was too much, obviously, but we knew this character was so rich. We already had thought about him becoming a mentor. The material for Brotherhood was already in gestation. Pule adds, it's an extension of Assassin's Creed 2. We just wanted to tell stories about the Italian Renaissance. Assassin's Creed 2 would have been too big if we had included Rome. It's a huge city, but it's hard to talk about the Italian Renaissance without talking about Rome, about all the power that was there, and about the charismatic figures of the different popes. In my mind, this was one game because this is one story. The Montreal team was also able to expand upon some of the systems present in the first 2 Assassin's Creed games. There was a huge evolution of the fighting system in Brotherhood, community development manager Gabriel Grazzani remembers. Inevitably, you were going to get into a fight. This was when we started to lock down combat, so that the counters were extremely varied. We got to spend more time working with those really tried and true systems that made Brotherhood. It's just so polished and looks much better than Assassin's Creed, and the game already looked incredible. Having introduced a variety of new gameplay verbs into Assassin's Creed design philosophy with the second entry in the series, the team was able to see which of these were popular and which the players would like to occur less. We knew that our gameplay blocks on the quest side had pretty good legs. We knew we could create a lot of cool stories, Bergeron says. But we also knew that some blocks, like the tailing blocks, weren't the most well-received based on data we were getting from players. We were able to reconfigure and readjust the numbers to change how often that kind of block came around. The ruling class. When it came to the story, Yohalim wanted to improve upon the already higher quality of script that had helped shepherd in with Assassin's Creed 2. One of the new core elements to Brotherhood's gameplay was the recruitment mechanic, by which Ezio can bring on board non-playable characters from the world to join the Assassin Brotherhood. These NPCs can be then sent off to do missions for the player, as well as partner up with Ezio for collaborative assassination moves. The idea of Ezio rebuilding the Assassins became core to the game's story. My goal going into Brotherhood was to make the script incredibly tight, he explains. I wanted to make it structurally and dialogue-wise like a movie. Every line, every word existed for a reason, or it was cut. It was continuing the story, focusing on character, and again, making sure that every line contained subtext and had a reason for being there. Each scene within the entire narrative was very structured. He continues, I had been reading Machiavelli's The Prince, among many other books. I knew that Machiavelli was going to be a character in Brotherhood because the time period was right, and he was in Rome then. What if this entire game is about how to be a great leader? Ezio needs to train these assassins, and he will likely end up becoming the leader of these assassins. In The Prince, there's this idea that you can rule through fear or through love. People misunderstood Machiavelli advocating for rule through fear because he actually advocates that it's better to rule through love, even though it's harder. He was trying to teach the Medicis how to be good rulers in that book. When it came to the bad guys, I figured I could do this really strong narrative structure where the bad guys each represent one of the negative ideas for Machiavelli, while Ezio represents the positive ideas. In the end, Machiavelli will write The Prince about Ezio. That fulfilled what I was looking for structurally. The number of ideas that Machiavelli had perfectly matched the number of sequences in the game, so it was just really strong thematically. Having chased and almost killed Rodrigo Borgia at the end of Assassin's Creed 2, Ezio was now going to go up against his son, Cesare Borgia, in Brotherhood. While Rodrigo was an important and influential figure within the Assassin's Creed universe, he was much older than Ezio. We had a little bit of fun with the main nemesis in Brotherhood, Alzazia says. We had a joke internally at Ubisoft where we asked for the arch-nemesis in Brotherhood to not be some old guy with a cane. The first two games have you fighting old men with canes. We wanted someone else, agile. By contrast, Cesare Borgia was a genius. Machiavelli based the Prince book on him. He was cunning, fierce, and completely ruthless. We wanted someone fit, agile, and strong. Honestly, he was a much better opponent for Ezio. We wanted someone who was the Templar equivalent of Ezio. We spent a lot of time working on his costume, his attitude, making him into an amazing nemesis. Killing together. In addition to Rome and Ezio's story arc, there had been plans to implement a multiplayer feature within Assassin's Creed 2. Like those aforementioned aspects, this mode was bumped due to production constraints, not least because the Anvil game engine that powered Assassin's Creed was initially incapable of running that kind of gameplay. It wasn't possible at all because Anvil wasn't a multiplayer online engine, Grandjohn says. Very quickly we understood that not only was it not technically feasible, but also that the design for multiplayer gameplay hadn't been made very clear when we worked on Assassin's Creed 2. With Brotherhood, we had an extra year to find a very precise core loop for multiplayer mode. In order to create a multiplayer element for Brotherhood, the Annecy team had to heavily tweak the Anvil game engine. This isn't all that surprising when you consider what Assassin's Creed core pillars are: sprawling and detailed open worlds, crowds that allow for social stealth, and players making their way around this world with fantastically detailed animation work. We wanted to have this multiplayer game with huge crowds, Grandjohn remembers. Having crowds of about 100 people required a lot of engineering work, so that's why it was a totally different engine. He continues, what makes Assassin's Creed a quality title is the good animation, the climbing system, and all the parkour. But the other challenge facing the Annecy studio was much more fundamental. What does an Assassin's Creed multiplayer game look like? The biggest thing was creating something that was fun and interesting enough within this fantasy of being an assassin, Grandjohn explains. Over a long period, we've iterated around hunting down a target, which is the classic loop in Assassin's Creed. However, it was quite difficult because we wanted to give the player clues about where their target was, but didn't want to just give them the solution. The player had to use both strategy and the tools at their disposal to make an informed guess in order to create the opportunity to kill their target. He continues, it was quite a long journey to figure out Wanted, the most played classic murder mode, but when we had the final version of it, it was quite obvious. We did numerous iterations during that first year, though. We iterated on every aspect of the gameplay. As well as being the hunter tracking down their prey, players were also the hunted. For the Annecy team, figuring out how much feedback to give players on both sides of the equation was critical for nailing Brotherhood's multiplayer mode. It was how we paced the game and how many players we had in the loop, Grandjohn says, as well as what tools we gave them and how precise the information we provided them with was. For example, we'd tell players that they were in the right zone and that they had to find their target, but we also needed to let them know that the assassin hunting them down was close by. It might not sound like much, but all of this feedback in the controller, camera, and characters was very complicated to tackle. The multiplayer feature in Assassin's Creed was a very different kind of experience to that found in other AAA blockbuster titles of the time. For starters, it wasn't a fast-paced shooter like Call of Duty. As a result, marketing this kind of experience was somewhat challenging. I felt that we should showcase the fact that Assassin's Creed was definitely not like other multiplayer games on the market, as AZ explains. It was about being cunning, hiding in plain sight, and killing your target. The marketing department was really keen on following the route established by other blockbuster titles or multiplayer games. Thankfully, we went with the alternative. It was a better angle that reflected what we wanted to achieve. Any anxiety that this new multiplayer mode wouldn't land with the general public went away the moment the team showed it off to consumers for the first time. Every character we had created for the multiplayer had been reused for the solo campaign. It was my first time at E3 when we made the reveal of it, Grandjohn says. I was discussing it with some friends who work at other studios. The thing I was most proud of was that every character we had created for the multiplayer had been reused for the solo campaign, since it cut down costs to reuse characters as bad guys in the story. The first day we presented the game to the public, we were very, very stressed. It was quite an original game. But at the end of the day, people were queuing for 4 hours to play the game. It was amazing. Those were probably my best memories in video game development. The introduction of multiplayer mode was, in fact, part of the reason why this entry in the franchise was given its name. At this point, Ezio was rebuilding the Assassin Brotherhood, but this was also the title where we introduced the multiplayer feature, Guaisden says. Hence, having the Brotherhood as the community, people were playing together. As mentioned earlier, Brotherhood was built in record time. This was a team that was performing at the absolute top of their game. Everyone was talking about how it was impossible, Yohalim remembers. Then after the game shipped and did so well and everything was wonderful, I heard that there was no other group of people that could have pulled that off. We were just working non-stop. I remember finishing the script for Brotherhood at dawn one day. The pace at which everything was done felt exhilarating. It's hard in this industry because there's this constant drive to iterate, to work and rework something. Michelangelo talked about how his sculptures emerged from the marble, and that if you then messed around with them too much, they would fall apart. I think if you're making a work of art, it has to come from that sense of instinct. It has to come from preparation. But you have to make the thing in one shot. Though created in less than a year, Brotherhood was a smash hit with the gaming community. The title was released in November 2010 and quickly became Ubisoft's best-selling launch at the time, selling over 1 million copies within its first week on sale. By the following March, Ubisoft had shipped a total of 7.2 million copies of the game. It was clear that the appetite for Assassin's Creed was huge. Assassin's Creed Revelations. Crossroads. Much like Brotherhood, Revelations started as an expansion for its predecessor. The upcoming Assassin's Creed 3 wasn't ready for release in 2011, and Ubisoft wanted to launch a project that year. Around the time that Brotherhood was greenlit, Ubisoft had decided it wanted to bring in the Foundation 9 Entertainment team, which had made the Assassin's Creed spin-offs Bloodlines and Discovery for the Sony PSP and Nintendo DS respectively, to work on another game that was going to round out Ezio's story. The title was going to have players go first to the Assassin's Castle in Masyaf and then to Constantinople. I worked on that from probably January to about July 2010, narrative director Darby McDevitt says. I was super excited about it. It was set around 1508. Suleiman the Magnificent was going to be about 10 or 12 years old. I pieced together a full story. We were working on the maps. It was really interesting. Internally, the game was codenamed Final Episode, but at E3 2010, the Kryptonite Games team, which was part of Foundation 9, was surprised to learn their project had been announced as The Last Legacy. Even more surprising was that the project was cancelled 1 month later, in July. Afterward, McDevitt left Kryptonite and signed up for some classes at film school in New York. By October, he was in the process of moving when Assassin's Creed creative director Alexandre Amanco called and asked if he was interested in working on a new project in the series. He read me a summary of the game that they were making, McDevitt laughs. It was the text that I had written explaining Ezio's journey to Masyaf and then Constantinople. He asked whether I'd be interested in working on that project, and I told him he had just read me something I had written. The high-level idea of Ezio going to Constantinople to find the keys to Altair's library was the same. Everything else in this story is different. Part of the reason for reviving this concept, which already existed within Ubisoft's stable, was expediency. The firm wanted a new Assassin's Creed game to launch in 2011. The next great leap forward, Assassin's Creed 3, was still a year away from being complete, so they had to fill the gap somehow. We decided to extend and finish Ezio's story in-game for developing Revelations, Guizden says. The plan was to do so very fast because, once again, we had less than a year with a new team. We needed to reuse material and be smart, so we took the skeleton of the Lost Legacy and enriched it. 2 months later, McDevitt started writing this final chapter in Ezio's life. The project was initially a small expansion, but this soon changed. It was actually going to be about 40% story and 60% multiplayer mode, McDevitt remembers. But the multiplayer team in Annecy said at the start of 2011 that they couldn't deliver everything they had promised, so we needed to extend the story aspect to justify charging full price. We really quickly came up with the idea of playing Altair for some bits, given that Ezio is already following in his footsteps. It was like a whirlwind. Between January and April, every single day there was a new idea. By April or May, we had written the whole script and started recording in May and June. Everything was mocapped really quickly. It all happened in a rush, but it turned out great. McDevitt was able to come at the story of Assassin's Creed Revelations with a unique perspective. Not only had he worked on 2 spin-offs in the franchise and 1 canceled project, but he was also a fan of the series. Brotherhood was a very good sequel, he enthused. It was made very quickly with strong foundation, and it built on not just the assassin fantasy, but also the story of a beloved character. When I got to write an older Ezio, I was writing from the position of both a fan as well as a guy who had written for the universe. That helped a lot in writing Revelations. As a fan, I was able to approach it and point out areas where I thought they could squeeze more drama out of this character. Yet as someone who is an experienced writer, I also comprehended the Assassin-Templar War. I understood what the team wanted to go in for in terms of bringing forth the history and the secret underlying conspiracy. So it was really a great moment. As always, Revelations was able to bring more gameplay innovations to the foray, including those that impacted how Ezio navigated around the world. It was hard to bring new features to the game, but the team still managed to pull it off, Guizden says. We introduced the bomb system as well as the hook blade. They made navigation much quicker. Everyone did their job really well. I was really impressed by what they achieved. Graziani adds, the hook was super interesting. It added new ingredients to parkour, but also changed how combat worked. It started to seem that we were just throwing in everything but the kitchen sink. By this point, the team members were experts in the Anvil engine. Many members had been working with this tech since its inception with the original Assassin's Creed, and, coupled with their expertise in the game consoles of the time, could get every last drop of performance out of it. The technical accomplishments in Revelations, in terms of the rendering of the characters and the amount of detail that they had, were massive, Graziana explains. The developers had had tons and tons of time to get comfortable with the engine, with the way it interacts with the machine. To me, Revelations is absolutely gorgeous. Painting a scene. Raphael Lacoste, who had worked on the original Assassin's Creed, made his return to Ubisoft in 2010 and was made the art director on Revelations. In this role, he was instrumental in recreating the Turkish capital of Constantinople. That was one of the best reasons to come back to Ubisoft, Lacoste laughs. This city has so many different landmarks, and the terrain is so interesting. There's 7 hills with different mosques and castles, but it's also a peninsula, so you have water all around the city with beautiful points of view. It was really fascinating to bring to life. All these different places and districts were really cool to animate. We did 2 scouting trips there. The first was for the sounds, sights, and textures. Then we came back just to take references for the textures. We took the actual tiles of the different walls, and that was very interesting too. Though the team went to great efforts to recreate parts of Constantinople, Lacoste's view on this process is that it shouldn't be a one-to-one simulation of the city. Though many landmarks such as the Hagia Sophia and Galata Tower were built within Revelations, the art director's perspective was about giving the space the correct feeling. Bringing Constantinople to life really stands out to me, he says. Those scouting trips helped us learn how to fill the light of the city, how to add immersion through sound, how to bring in the composition. It was truly fascinating. We tried to get the most information we could from the actual locations, but we didn't want to do something that was liberal. Instead, we wanted to portray the emotion and the soul of the place. We aimed to bring the city alive for the player, so we had to take the time to digest everything in order for us to convey the feel of it. But it wasn't a literal recreation or a documentary. It was about making this kind of dream and conveying the essence of a place. In contrast to the cities of the first Assassin's Creed, where time was static, Revelations was to feature a day-night cycle. In other words, the time of day would naturally change over the course of the gameplay. Animating Constantinople was super interesting because we wanted every single hour of the day to be like an intense painting, Lacoste remembers. That was a new challenge. Constantinople had multiple phases, multiple moods, and the immersion was really stimulating as well, because you could play sequences during nighttime. It felt a bit like Arabian Nights with the cyan blue sky and candles in the windows. If you play at sunset, it's very impressive with all the fog and mist that's lit by sunlight. Every single moment in the day brought different kinds of immersions and emotions. That was pretty new for us. Though he was primarily hired to work on Assassin's Creed 3, Revelations was also the first entry in the franchise to benefit from Ubisoft's in-house historian, Maxime Durand. My role was to try to make sure that I give the development team as much information as possible, he explains. That way I could inspire them to get into something that's closer to real history. That was really the big challenge. Setting the game in Constantinople gave the team a chance to depict a rather unique period in history. When most people think of the Roman Empire, they think of the western portion, but Roman rule stretched far into the east as well. From a western perspective, we always think of Rome as Durand says. We think of Rome as this empire that fell and was dislocated, but it continued in the east until the Ottomans took it over. Many kingdoms tried to get the Byzantines out, but actually it was the Ottomans who succeeded in taking over Constantinople, which at the time was one of the most magnificent cities in the world. So that's definitely something interesting I learned from that period. I only knew Suleiman by name before starting my research. His epithet, the Magnificent, is a reflection of his importance in the Ottoman history. He continues, researching for Revelations was a real challenge, simply because it was hard to find much information about that part of the world that was in English or Western languages. In addition to recreating the Turkish capital and center of the Byzantine Empire, the narrative team went to great pains to properly recreate the Ottoman Empire in Revelations. This, in many ways, was a very different world to that of the Italian Renaissance. I felt an enormous amount of pressure to represent a culture that I didn't know much about, McDevitt says. I had never read up on the Ottomans, who were the great Islamic empire that existed from the late Middle Ages to the beginning of the 20th century. I did what I thought was a tremendous amount of reading back then. I do even more now. It felt like a tremendous honor, but also a tremendous responsibility. I took it very seriously and I worked really hard. Revelations' Constantinople setting was one reason why the game was nearly named Crossroads, given that the city was the meeting point of several religions and civilizations. In the end, however, the team went with Revelations, something which made little sense to McDevitt. We thought that it would be called Crossroads, but that just wasn't sexy enough, apparently, he laughs. Then Revelations was suggested and I actually fought against it. I didn't know what it meant because nothing is truly revealed. I thought it was going to be very disappointing. The game had a great ending, but the title misled people into thinking something was going to be revealed. Following in the footsteps of Brotherhood, multiplayer mode made a return for Assassin's Creed Revelations. With Brotherhood out in the wild, the NSC team was able to look at what worked and what could be improved when it came to the Assassin's Creed multiplayer feature. The mode had been well received, with a lot of fans spending time within this competitive part of the game, but there were some issues that needed fixing. As soon as we started with the multiplayer mode on Brotherhood, the community was complaining about roofers, Graziano remembers. These were players who would stand on the roof and wait before attacking people. We had players complaining about this. The developers felt that these people were playing the game wrong. In the end, we came up with a solution. The developers made it so that throwing knives would knock players off roofs. If you saw someone on a roof, it was obvious that they weren't an NPC. The main thing about multiplayer mode was being able to pretend to be an NPC. With Brotherhood, the multiplayer component was new. There weren't really any expectations, as no one outside of Ubisoft really knew what a competitive Assassin's Creed mode would look like. With Revelations, it was about reproducing the things that worked, while also creating and hyping up newer features and settings, all without breaking it. There was a very subtle balancing process regarding the gameplay. There was a lot of pressure on the NSC team, though. The studio had been given a mandate to release more maps for Revelations multiplayer mode, but in the end they were unable to produce everything they had hoped to. We only had 5 maps at launch, Grandjohn explains. Honestly, we didn't have enough time. The entire game was made in 9 months. The multiplayer element in Revelations was about trying to push the bar when it came to gameplay. We were really targeting a Hollywood level of quality within the soundtrack. Revelations had another bump in quality when it came to its audio design. Jesper Kidd, who had worked on the music for Assassin's Creed since its inception, returned, but Ubisoft also brought in Lauren Balfe, Hans Zimmer's prodigy, to work on the soundtrack. Having two composers on a project was quite unique at the time, music supervisor Simon Landry explains. Lauren did do amazing work for the cutscenes, while Jesper was famous for his work in open-world games. Splitting up the work was a smart way to address those aggressive timelines. The game's score was also the first to be recorded using a live orchestra. We were really targeting a Hollywood level of quality with the soundtrack, Landry explains. All the cutscenes were produced with a live orchestra toward the end of the project, and most of them were integrated at Dolby 5.1 surround sound. End of Ezio. Revelations culminates in one of the series' most powerful scenes, Ezio meeting his predecessor Altair, as well as Desmond, his descendant, hundreds of years in the future in the game's present day. Revelations is all quite a blur, but I clearly remember writing the final scene, McDevitt says. I felt that it was fairly powerful, but worried whether we were going to be able to execute it well. One of the difficulties in those days was that we always recorded the dialogue first, and then we had body doubles come in for our motion capture. We would never know how the scene would play out. Nowadays, we capture both dialogue and performance at the same time, so we have a better sense of if a scene was going to be a great take. Back then, it was a little bit more up in the air as to whether or not this would come together well. I remember going to LA to record all the dialogue for Revelations in Embers, which was really bittersweet. It was weird because you're making this game set in the Ottoman Empire about this old assassin, but in reality you're sitting in Venice Beach in the summertime in a studio, and you're just hanging out with this actor, Roger Craig Smith, who's been working at the character of Ezio for a few years now. It was really a fun time. This right here is a movie poster for the Assassin's Creed Embers short film here. Dying of the Light. Though Assassin's Creed Revelations was the last game to feature Ezio, he did not die during the course of that title's events. The Ubisoft team wanted to give this beloved character a proper send-off with a short film called Embers. It felt like a huge responsibility, McDevitt admits. We also wanted to have Ezio leave behind his playboy ways, get settled down, and get married. To be honest, I felt a tremendous pressure about closing his story. Embers had, in many ways, more of a traditional shooting process compared to a video game. Because it was a film, it followed as much a more traditional trajectory, McDevitt explains. You write a script, you say you're happy with that script, you start animating things and recording dialogue, and then you polish it. Games are not like that. You don't write a script first and then make it. It's like trying to build a film camera while you're shooting the movie. Revelations was pretty short, so I was able to keep the whole script in my head and make revisions as needed. The script for Embers was a little bit longer. With Embers, the Ubisoft Transmedia team also wanted to test whether or not it could reuse assets created for its video games and other mediums such as film. We wanted to see if it was possible to recycle the world that had been created, Azazi explains. We applied a cel-shading filter and used some of the locations from our games as backdrops in Embers. Every single background came straight from a game. Sadly, it never worked. We had the whole pipeline up and running, but the results of the test weren't really conclusive. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there were some extra scenes which didn't make the cut in Embers. There were originally some scenes with Machiavelli at the beginning where he's actually reading excerpts from one of his plays, McDevitt says. The real Machiavelli became something of a playwright at the end of his life, so he was coming to read some pages of his new play to Ezio. Meanwhile, Ezio wanted him to drink some of his new wine, that year's vintage. That scene was cut because the team didn't have enough time to make a full Machiavelli character. We really had to keep it simple, so we did Sophia, Ezio, Xiao Jun, and Flavia, and then a few bad guys. We didn't have enough budget to make a Machiavelli, and we needed to keep it under 25 minutes or so. There was also a scene where Ezio says goodbye to Machiavelli, and they talk about Leonardo da Vinci, passing away a couple of years before. And Ezio says, I was actually with him when he passed away. And Machiavelli replies, I hope he's in a better place. You know, that kind of thing. We wanted to bring some closure, but sadly that was cut, and it instead jumped into Ezio writing his letters. I wish we could have seen Machiavelli and had a reference to Leonardo, but we couldn't. The reason that the end of Ezio's life was not shown within Revelations is due to a subtle bit of Assassin's Creed lore. The way genetic memory was supposed to work in the Animus was that as soon as anyone had a descendant, as soon as they have kids, when you go back into the Animus, you would be reliving their child's memory. You wouldn't be able to go back into your ancestor's memory, as Ezio says. By the time Embers takes place, Ezio has had multiple kids. There's no way we could, within the Animus, and within our constraint of having to play Desmond, show how Ezio would die. It had to be from an external standpoint. By the time of his death, Ezio had starred in 3 of his own mainline Assassin's Creed games, as well as 1 spin-off. He had become one of the most iconic characters in video games at the time, second only to long-standing icons like Halo's Master Chief. With the Ezio trilogy, the Assassin's Creed franchise went from being the new kid on the block to one of the best-selling series in the medium, selling millions of copies each and every year. It had taken Ubisoft from a medium player to one of the biggest game companies in the world. There was no stopping the Assassin's Creed behemoth. Having explored the Crusades, the Italian Renaissance, and the Ottoman Empire, it was time for a different kind of game entirely, as the franchise moved across the Atlantic to another foundational moment in history. A change of creed. After Brotherhood, Ubisoft decided to change the Assassin's Creed logo. The crest present in the first two titles was asymmetrical, with one side of the crest being thinner than the other. The team decided to make it symmetrical, something that was partly inspired by Ubisoft's growing ambitions for the Assassin's Creed brand. We had what had become an iconic crest, which could be adapted to whatever context, Grusdun said. This was at a time where we were starting to develop the transmedia strategy. I was working on a Facebook project, and the first comic book, The Fall, about the Russian Revolution was also in the works. There was clearly this need to send a signal every time that this was an Assassin's Creed product. From this point on, the team also played more with the creed, making it fit with the project's time frame and theme. From this point on, the team also played more with the crest, making it fit with the project's time frame and theme. Adapting the logo based on the context came out quite naturally, Royston says. We could do so much with that. Roger Craig Smith. For a time, Ezio Auditore de Firenze was one of video games' most iconic characters, and this was in no small part due to the talent of voice actor Roger Craig Smith. As with any role, his time with Assassin's Creed started with a simple audition. When he was told he was going to voice an Italian, Smith decided to channel the accent of Grand Prix motorcycle champion Valentino Rossi, with precise enunciation of every syllable and consonant. I told Ubisoft I'd try my best, but Italian wasn't necessarily my strong suit, Smith remembers. They told me that for the purpose of this role, they were going to go for more of a Spanish accent, like Antonio Banderas. Indeed, a lot of the work that Smith put into the role was working with the developers to figure out exactly how Ezio should sound. After all, we don't actually know how people spoke during the Italian Renaissance. We were always working on the writing and trying to find out the fine blend of accents, Smith says. I call it Italian Spanglish. It's Italian, Spanish, and English all blended together to make it more palatable to the Western ear. Part of the reason why Smith auditioned and why he landed the role was his ability to do a variety of age ranges. After all, the plan was to try to tell Ezio's story from being a young womanizer all the way through to becoming a master assassin. There definitely was the sense that this character was going through an evolution, Smith says. He was going from being a carefree playboy, sitting on the roof with his brother, and talking about the good life they lead, through the reality of losing his family. He then gains all this anger, has to learn to control it, and then gains the understanding that he is part of something much bigger than himself. All of that was in the writing. From the start, Smith says he knew that Assassin's Creed 2 was special. It was more ambitious than many video games at the time. There was a lot of metal on this bone for me to chew on from a performance standpoint, and that was rare at the time, he explains. It was a really cool thing to be a part of. It was so different to screaming out, "I need ammo," or "reloading," or "machine gun on the hill." A lot of the games back then had the same war stuff over and over again. Then all of a sudden, here was this game, and these moments of familiar love, friendship, and camaraderie, trust, betrayal, and corruption. But what moment stands out the most to Smith from his time voicing Ezio? It has to be the moment where Ezio does an assassination in a town square, and he declares to everybody that the Auditore are not dead, Smith says. "I'm still here, me, Ezio Auditore." I think we did 2 takes of that moment. I remember saying that I was really going to yell and scream the time out. To me, that is the moment where he's becoming more capable. He's essentially tasted blood and is calling out the people who caused so much tragedy for his family. He's letting them know that his sole purpose is to come for them. Now, this kind of writing has become much more commonplace. Narrative is so important in gaming, but I just remember thinking this was so much fun. And that concludes Chapter 2, guys. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this book and the next chapter in the history of Assassin's Creed, 15th anniversary, the making of Assassin's Creed, the 15th anniversary, Chapter 3, the Kenway Dynasty. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.